This hearing will come to order. Today, the committee will discuss the interim nuclear agreement which the United States and 5 other nations have reached with Iran last month, and we welcome our Secretary of State, the Honorable John Kerry, to address the questions of the committee members here regarding the administration's plan. And Mr. Secretary, we very much appreciate you coming before the committee today. And while we will debate how best to derail Iran's nuclear weapons program, I know that you and all of us appreciate that it poses a threat to our national security here in the United States. Congress has played a key role in U.S. policy towards Iran, mainly by driving sanctions against the regime. And I'll remind the members of this committee that the legislation which we passed here passed out unanimously. Legislation that the Royce-Engel bill, which passed the House of Representatives last summer, passed by a vote of 400 to 20. So we look forward to a constructive discussion today. These are high-stake issues, but I am confident that the spirit of bipartisanship will prevail, as it typically does on this committee, and we welcome our Secretary of State here today. The key issue is whether a final agreement would allow Iran to manufacture nuclear fuel. Unfortunately, the interim agreement raises some questions about this. My concern is that we may have bargained away our fundamental position, which is enshrined in 6 UN Security Council resolutions. And that fundamental agreement is that Iran should not be enriching and reprocessing. And we may bargain that away for a false confidence that we can effectively block Iran's misuse of these key nuclear bomb-making technologies. Just within the last few days, Iran has announced plans to press on and improve its centrifuge technology in order to enrich uranium. Meanwhile, on Wednesday, we had the comment from the foreign minister of Iran stating that Iran was going to continue construction at the plutonium reactor at Iraq, which will be capable of producing weapons-grade plutonium once it's operational. And we had another comment from those in the regime that they may produce, that they will set up more of these plutonium reactors. That tells us something about Iran's intentions, and that is why we are concerned about how this agreement will be enforced. Yes, we agree, on the concept of verification, that we have to have good verification. One of the things we remember as we deal with this government in Iran is that it is one that aggressively supports terrorism, supports the most radical groups. In 2006, I was in Haifa when it was being shelled, and it was being shelled specifically with Iranian missiles and missiles provided, rockets provided by Syria. This is a regime which, as we were reminded not too long ago, Mr. Ted Deutsch reminded me that when we heard the rally and the slogan, "Death to America," it was not just the Basiji that were marching. It was members of the government as well that were shouting, "Death to America." It is a regime which brutally represses its own people. And oftentimes the way a country treats its own citizens tells you how it might treat others. And it threatens our ally with extinction, saying that Israel is a country which could be destroyed with just one bomb. It is that kind of commentary out of the regime that gives us pause. And it has, and this is the important point to many of us, it has a history of deceiving the international community about its nuclear program. The director of the IAEA raised that concern with me. It has that history, and it's pursuing a ballistic missile program in violation of UN Security Council resolutions as well. So Iran is not just another country. It simply can't be trusted with enrichment technology because verification efforts can never be foolproof with respect to their ability to get undetectable nuclear breakout. That's one of the concerns we have. An agreement in which Iran purchases and returns spent nuclear fuel for energy generation is one thing. That's something that we were willing to get an agreement on. But allowing enrichment, I feel, is too high, going beyond the lines of realistic international control. There's been a lot of talk about whether Iran has the right to enrich technology. This committee has held several hearings on the Non-Proliferation Treaty over the years. It is clear that Iran has no such right under that treaty. And while I've heard the administration say that Iran has no right, it's a moot point if an agreement permits enrichment, giving Iran a de facto right. The proposed sanctions relief is another concern. The sanctions pressure that drove Iran to the negotiating table took years to build. While the interim agreement relief is limited, governments throughout the world will not be easily convinced to reverse course and ratchet up sanctions pressure if Iran is only buying time with this agreement. Moreover, companies have stayed away from Iran as much due to the atmosphere of international isolation as to the letter of U.S. sanctions law. I am concerned that that may now be lost, because foreign-based oil companies have jumped to start discussions with Iran. This is the headline from Wall Street Journal: Iran deal opens door for businesses. We've got to counter that impression. Lastly, a point I want to make is that sanctions have worked elsewhere. International sanctions pressure brought down the immoral apartheid regime in South Africa. That led to South Africa not only releasing Nelson Mandela from prison, but also abandoning its nuclear arsenal, giving up its atomic bomb. A bipartisan coalition from Newt Gingrich to John Kerry supported those tough sanctions, even overriding a presidential veto. Negotiations, quiet diplomacy was tried first, but at the end of the day, there was the intent that if we did not achieve the result, that the overwhelming sanctions would be imposed, and indeed they were, and indeed they worked. We are facing an immoral and very dangerous regime in Iran, one nearing a nuclear weapon. I am hard-pressed to understand why we'd be letting up sanctions pressure at the very time its economy is on the ropes without getting an agreement which stops its centrifuges from spinning. I think all of us expected that the sanctions would be used to get an agreement that stopped the centrifuge program, to stop those from spinning, and that is my basic concern here. I now turn to Ranking Member Engel for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Kerry, thank you for appearing before the committee today and for your tireless efforts to enhance the security and prosperity of the United States. Thank you, Chairman Royce, for calling this hearing on an issue that's obviously of paramount importance to American national security. Upon taking office nearly 5 years ago, President Obama inherited an almost non-existent strategy to deal with the looming threat of Iran obtaining a nuclear weapons capability. The President initially focused on the diplomatic track, but the limitations of that one-dimensional approach soon became apparent when Iran walked away from the P5+1 negotiations in October of 2009. After that, the administration shifted to a two-track strategy, which coupled engagement with increasing economic pressure through sanctions, while making it clear that all options remain on the table. This is the policy I favored, and the President, together with Secretary Clinton, succeeded beyond expectations in uniting the international community against Iran's nuclear ambitions. The UN Security Council and the European Union, acting in parallel with our efforts, imposed tough new sanctions on Iran. This committee took the lead on a bipartisan basis to pass biting sanctions legislation, the Royce-Engel bill, designed to cripple the Iranian economy, giving the administration the tools it needed to change the calculus of the Iranian regime. That was a bill that passed unanimously out of this committee. I was very, very proud of it to work on such a bipartisan basis with Chairman Royce, and then passed the floor, as the Chairman has pointed out, by a vote of 400 to 20. It was, I think, one of the finer days of the United States House of Representatives. Over the last 3 years, President Obama has signed 4 major Iran sanctions bills into law. Taken together with international sanctions, this has made it exceedingly difficult for Iran to sell its oil on the global markets, cut off Tehran from the international financial system, and severely limited Iran's access to hard currency. Several weeks ago, thanks to sustained efforts by Congress and the administration, the Iranians finally admitted that the sanctions are hurting them badly. And for the first time, they started talking about the specifics of a negotiated settlement to curtail their nuclear program. As all of us know, the P5+1 reached an interim agreement with Iran at the end of November. And Secretary Kerry, I want to commend you for your incredible personal efforts to secure this deal. It makes me tired just watching all of your travel back and forth across the Atlantic and around the world. But having said that, I want to make it clear that I have some serious reservations about the agreement. First and foremost, it seems to me at a minimum, it should have required Iran to suspend uranium enrichment as demanded by 6 separate UN Security Council resolutions. I don't think it's asking too much of Iran to say that at least while we're talking, you stop enriching. For the 6-month period while we're talking, Iran, in my estimation, should not, again, going counter to 6 separate UN Security Council resolutions. It makes me wonder how serious they are and how sincere they are in terms of really wanting to negotiate in good faith. Mr. Secretary, you and other administration officials have sought to make the case that the interim agreement will place significant restraints on the Iranian nuclear program and not allow it to advance while we negotiate a long-term settlement to eliminate the threat of an Iranian nuclear weapons capability once and for all. You've also said that the sanctions relief we are providing is very limited and reversible. I hope you're right, and I'm sure you'll agree with me that the interim agreement must be fully implemented and completely verified. I can assure you that Congress will act immediately to ratchet up the pressure at the first sign of cheating or backtracking by Iran. Mr. Secretary, I hope you can confirm for the committee today that the administration will continue to enforce all sanctions that remain in place during the implementation of the interim agreement, and that you will not hesitate to designate additional entities for sanctions over the next 6 months as circumstances warrant. In addition, I hope you will send a clear message to businesses all over the world that now is not the time to make plans to re-enter Iran. And again, the Chairman showed that headline in the Wall Street Journal. In order for me to support a comprehensive agreement, restraints must be put in place to assure us that Iran cannot continue down the path of a nuclear weapon. In that context, Secretary Kerry, I hope you will address the following questions in our discussion today. First, if Iran retains any enrichment capacity, how can we be sure that they will not forever remain on the brink of a breakout capacity? Second, why do many of our closest regional allies feel the interim deal caught them by surprise? And what are you doing to make certain that they are included as negotiations continue on a final deal? 3, allies of the United States that look at Iran as an existential threat to them, Saudi Arabia, Israel, United Arab Emirates, all oppose the deal. They're the ones closest to it. Why is that the case? Why does the administration strongly oppose congressional action on Iran's sanctions legislation that makes clear new sanctions will not be imposed unless Iran violated the terms of the interim deal? So now that we have an interim deal, we must focus with laser-like intensity on ensuring that any long-term agreement dismantles all Iranian nuclear infrastructure that could lead to a breakout capacity. Any deal which does not achieve that goal will be a devastating failure. Mr. Secretary, it's critical that you and the President consult very closely with Congress as you implement the interim agreement and negotiate a final deal. Waivers in existing sanctions legislation will only get you so far, and it's likely that Congress would have to pass legislation to implement any comprehensive deal. But it will be impossible to take that step unless members of this committee and the full House are fully informed and absolutely convinced that Iran has agreed to verifiably abandon its efforts to develop a nuclear weapons capability. And finally, Mr. Secretary, as you continue to engage with the Iranians, and I know you know this, but I really need to mention it, I would urge you to remain cognizant of the fact that Iran remains the top state sponsor of terrorism in the world, continues to support Hezbollah and the brutal Assad regime in Syria, continues to engage in systematic violations of human rights, continues its efforts to destabilize a number of Persian Gulf states, and continues to imprison innocent Americans. All of this under the so-called moderate Rouhani government. So again, Mr. Secretary, thank you for appearing today, and I look forward to hearing your testimony.